Finally, I've done it. I've caught all 151 Pokemon. There are no more to catch, ever. No, wait. What I mean is that I have finally bought a Nikon D700, this one here. And I just have to say, you were right, it's very good. And it does render a bit differently than the D3S. But is it so different that you can easily tell which is which? We'll get into that later. In short though, if you just wanted to know, do I like the D700 and generally what I think of it? Well, here it is. It's definitely one of my favorite Nikon cameras that I own to date. I like it more than the D200. I think it's overall a nicer feel than the D800 and more convenient than the D3S. So if that's all you wanted to know, feel free to click away now. Otherwise, if you want me to get into the long version of it, we're going to do that right now. What is the Nikon D700? Well, it's this camera right here. And the D700 is a full-frame DSLR, introduced in July of 2008. It features a 12.1 megapixel CMOS sensor, the NC81338L. Excellent name. It's the slightly older relative to the NC81361A, also good name, used in the D3S. Obviously, the camera used the Nikon F-mount and it features sensor cleaning. No IBIS though, that was the dark times before IBIS. The D700 has an ISO range of 200 to 6400, or with the boost enabled, 100 to 25,600. The shutter is good for 30 seconds to 1/8000th of a second, and flash sync is 1/250th. Plus, the rating for this shutter is 150,000 shutter smacks. The camera uses the Multicam 3500 FX for autofocus, and that means that it has 51 AF points, 15 of which are cross-type. The metering is handled by Nikon's 3D Color Matrix Metering 2, which is a 1005 pixel sensor. The D700 can shoot at 5 FPS, but if you have the battery grip, it will give you a boosty to 8 FPS if you use the Nikon EL4 or EL4A batteries or a bajillion AA batteries with it. Can someone explain the logic behind this to me? Because I don't get why it needs to use those to get this speed. Anyways, the rear of the camera features a 3-inch LCD with 920K dots, and the D700 features a built-in flash with a GN of 12. It uses CF cards for memory, and the standard battery pack is the ENEL3E battery pack, and it's rated for 1000 shots of the CEPA variety. The D700 comes in at 1085 grams with the battery and memory card, more than half a knocked. When the D700 was new, this camera came in at $29.99 USD, or in sad today times, roughly 4,510-ish USD, or in Canada stand dollars, 6,235-ish dollars. This hurts. What is special about the D700? Well, it's Nikon's first compact Pro DSLR. At the time that it was released, the D700 was seen as a baby D3. The body featured weather sealing, the AF system is directly lifted out of the D3, and why do I bring this up? Well, maybe you know. I am a fan of the 5D series of cameras. But when you compare the D700 to the 5D2 or 5DC, you can really get a feel for how Canon was swinging the cripple hammer. And I get it. It was to help with product differentiation. If you put the 1D AF system in a 5D, nah. But Nikon did it right here. And it's pretty great. It was just kind of neat to see that Nikon doesn't usually loan out the Canon cripple hammer. Operation and feel. The Nikon D700 shines in ergonomics, in part because it's using Nikon's most perfectest series of camera bodies as its basis. The D700 body design has more or less been lifted from the D300, which is more or less a perfected D200. As a result of me already doing a D200 video, I'm not going to dwell too much on the awesome perfection of the layout, since most people are probably already aware of my opinion about it. And if you're not, have a look at the D200 video review. I'll link to that in the description below and in a card thingy up here. At any rate, the D700 has almost the exact same layout as the D200. It is therefore exceptionally intuitive and generally a nice feeling camera. The grip on the camera is very good. The Nikon dual command dial layout is very neat, and it uses Nikon's multi-way controller, this thingy over here. And while it's not as good as an AF joystick, it's not bad. Nikon would take a little while before adopting the AF joystick, which is too bad, because it's pretty awesome. The only real visible difference you can tell between the D700 and the D200 or D300 series is that the multi-way controller actually has a bit of a tweak. You can see there, the center button has its own little button. It's not integrated into the pad. And this is actually quite nice, because then it makes misclicking on the D-pad a little less likely, and it makes this particular D-pad a little more precise, making the interface on the D700 a little more perfect. One thing I will say about the D700 though is bulk. It can't really be understated. Despite it being called a compact full-frame camera, this camera came out in the era of, the 5D2, the Sony A900, and the D700 is the heaviest of the bunch. It's a noticeable difference as well. The D700 is almost 200 grams heavier than a 5D2 and about 150 grams heavier than the A900. That being said, this heft does feel extremely solid. Build quality, to me, is excellent. And admittedly, if you're coming from a lighter DSLR like the D300 or D200, you're going to notice how much heavier this camera is. I personally don't mind it, but that's just me. I know I'm more used to chunkier cameras than others, but I do understand for many the weight is a real consideration. And that's what it comes down to. The D700, I do believe, is one of the heaviest DSLRs, full-frame DSLRs, that doesn't come with a vertical grip. The D700, if you look at it at the back, it features something familiar. It features Nikon's finder hump from the D3 series and the finder eye cup as well, which again gives it a bit of a distinct feeling from the D200 and D300 that the body is based on. And it gives it a little more of a serious look, I think. I do gotta point out though, although this hump and the eye cup looks like it's from this series, the finder is different. The D700 finder is 95% coverage, not the 100% coverage you get on the D3. Either way, still a nice visual cue for the D700. When it comes to the rear screen, 920 dots still looks reasonably good today. It is not going to blow your mind if you're coming from modern rear panels, but it gets the job done, and I do find that punching in is fairly snappy on it and visible in direct sunlight, although it does get washed out. The menu is obviously Nikon's classic menu system, easy to navigate. The only thing that is kind of weird is the auto ISO. It's kind of annoying. It requires a considerable amount of menu diving and then going into the menu to click that you want to enable it. But I can kind of forgive it given that auto ISO was kind of a thing that was coming into its own in the timeline or in the camera development time frame at the time. But I will say the implementation of the auto ISO when you get it going is pretty solid. More weirdness on the rear screen, specifically live view. It is clunky. In order to get into live view, you have to move the shooting mode dial into live view mode. Then you can press the shutter and it comes up. And if you press the shutter again, it'll shoot. Or if you half press it, it'll do your autofocus using the AF module. But it is just not a particularly smooth experience. You can punch in and you can do your live view things, but it does feel like an early live view because it is. That being said, it does support, again, autofocus by flipping down that mirror. And it, again, because of the clunkiness, if you switch the live view autofocus mode into tripod mode, the camera will also actually do contrast detect, but it's very slow. It's not very good. And again, because it is a very early implementation of live view, there are no aids in live view other than punching in. There are no zebras or zebras. There's no other posting aids like peeking. So take that into account if you are a person that enjoys using live view. It is a reasonable live view experience, just clunky. Image quality and AF. The Nikon D700, like the D3 and the D3S, made the choice of having big pixels instead of big megapixels. And I personally think this was a good trade-off. The camera also features an AA filter, since at the time this was the norm for most cameras. That being said, per pixel sharpness is still pretty good, and it seems like the filter on here was fairly weak. Now, the sensor in general fares pretty well against other full-frame cameras of the time, despite its lower megapixel count compared to the likes of the 5D2 or A900. And again, part of this has to do with the fact that they used big pixels. For example, when it comes to noise performance, the D700 is generally fairly competitive, and the D3S, as you may know from before, is extremely good. Dynamic range on the D700 is also fairly nice. Again, probably akin to the chunkier pixels. While not quite up to modern standards, it's pretty easy to adapt to if you're coming from a modern camera. The files do have fairly good flexibility, just not infinite flexibility. Of course, being 12.1 megapixels, cropping room is a little bit limited. And let's have a quick look at some noise samples while we're here. Looking at the files, I'd be perfectly happy shooting the D700 at ISO 6400 and up to 12,800 with noise reduction. I think it looks perfectly fine, especially if you correct with color noise. And the luminance noise, while it does erase some detail, I think it doesn't look too bad. Here's something I do want to talk about that I don't normally bring up when it comes to camera reviews, mainly because I'm usually shooting RAW and I do a lot of post in my images anyways. Color and color rendering, specifically in relation to the D3S. When I did my D3S review, I had a considerable number of comments that while the D3S sensor is similar enough and the noise performance was good, there were a lot of comments that again pointed out rendering on the D3S was just different. It was not the same, it was less good. And basically it came down to whatever tweaks were done to get the extra noise performance for the D3S wasn't worth the penalty in the way that the color rendering changed. But before we get into that, let's have a look at the actual comparison between the D3S and the D700 in terms of noise. When the noise creeps in on either the D700 or D3S, I don't actually notice a huge difference in the way the cameras render the noise itself. That said, the D3S does clearly suppress noise better. The noise characteristics are similar, but I do feel that at higher ISOs, the luminance noise does not eat into detail as much on the D3S as it does on the D700. Both also exhibit pretty similar color noise patterns when you're shooting, and that is generally easy enough to remove. I would say the D3S easily handles high ISO better than the D700, with noise performance, I think, being about 1 to 1.5 stops better, in that if I were to shoot the D3S at 6400, it would look pretty similar to the D700 at ISO 3200. And as I said, the way that the noise renders, if I shot at 6400 here and 3200 here, the noise rendering would look basically identical. And if I shot at the same noise, this one, or same ISO, the noise performance on this would just look cleaner. Although again, rendering of said noise looks pretty similar, which makes sense since the sensors are related. So yes, I did notice there was a difference in color rendition. When I disabled color profiles from my editing software, when I matched the color temperatures and tints, I do admit the D700 does render in a way that I prefer more. The D700 renders colors that I think look a little more true to life, a little earthier, if you will. The D3S, to me, just looked a little more exaggerated. Its saturation levels are a little bit higher, and it looks like it specifically punched up greens quite a bit more, in a way that looked a little unnatural, and the D700 didn't do that. And again, I do find that I do like it on the D700, that the output is just more earthy, if you will. Now what this means is that the D700 output is closer to how I would edit an image than the D3S is right from the get-go. I don't think that the color differences though were so different that I'd have a hard time editing for either camera. It would just warrant me spending a little more time tweaking on the D3S than on the D700. I imagine that shooting JPEGs, this might be more of an issue, and I could understand why people might prefer the D700 for its more natural colors than the D3S, especially again if you are a JPEG shooter. When it comes to autofocus, the D700 is a champ. The AF system is pretty much top notch. I found that it personally, for what I shot, tracked things pretty well. I find the coverage is pretty solid for a DSLR system, and I didn't have any specific issues with it. Again, the way I shoot, however, is still primarily using Focus Recompose, as I do on most other DSLRs, other than when I'm forcing myself to use the other points on the camera system for specifically looking at the camera to review. Now, when it comes to tracking, it is obviously going to be less advanced than other mirrorless systems. Its ability to track is going to be fairly basic, and it's not going to be able to track things going through walls or whatever. It is, however, a traditional phase detect system, and it is a good one. If you need to shoot sports or moving objects, the D700 won't let you down as long as you give the D700 the time of day to learn the system and learn how it reacts. All that said though, the D700 isn't a particularly fast shooter. It shoots at 5 FPS, and while I wouldn't call that super slow, especially for a DSLR, it's not super fast. Now, let's have a listen to the burst rate. I like that sound. It's got a good ka-chunk. It's got the ka-chunk that you think of when you think DSLR. All right, let's have a look at the sample gallery. does the D700 live up to the hype? I'm sure if you've been watching reviews, retrospectives on the D700, you may have been taken in by the D700 hype. You may have gotten the impression that if you bought a D700, you'd see a magic in your photos. I've heard things from the D700 makes CCD-like images too. The D700s have an organic look to them. Lots of intangible phrases that hype it up. But when it comes to just image output, I personally think that even though, yes, the D3S sensor is tweaked, the output from the two is still similar enough, especially when shooting RAWs. Both cameras can be made to have similar outputs, with the bonus that the D3S will provide better noise performance. And I'll have to assume that since the D700 sensor is the same as the regular D3 sensor, the images out of the D700 will be even closer to match shooting on just the base D3. That being said, I don't have a D3 to compare them side by side, but I do imagine that shooting RAWs on the D3 and D3 or D700 are going to be similar, and shooting JPEG will likely be similar on them as well. Although, again, with the D3S, you will probably notice a difference if you look closely, and you will probably notice a difference if you shoot JPEG. I don't shoot JPEG, so not going to comment too much on that. I review these cameras mostly the way I would normally shoot them for me. In terms of just imaging, the 12 megapixels on the D700, on the D3S, on the D3 should be pretty excellent. It's definitely excellent on the D700 and D3S. And I wouldn't choose one or the other just for pure technical image output. If you want an opinion from someone who does JPEGs though, I would look elsewhere and not me. I'll see if I can find some and link them in the description below, since that's probably what you want to look for anyways. That said, as a whole, I do find the 12 megapixels from this camera to be very nice. It works well for looking through any monitor and prints fairly large anyways. What I'm saying is that if, again, you're looking through an image output perspective only and you shoot RAW, feel free to look at the D3, D3S, as well as the D700, even though the D700 is getting a bit popular due to hype. Where I really think though the D700 does shine is when you combine the image output, which is generally good, with the smaller body. Yes, it is the heaviest of the DSLRs, or one of the heaviest, that don't feature a battery grip. But this form factor is generally very convenient. And as I mentioned, I do really like it. And even though I do like the balanced nature of the big chunky D3S, in truth, that only applies when I'm actually shooting it. When I have to actually carry it around, that's another story. I have a lot of cameras and a lot of camera bags, but these things are just inconvenient to carry around. They don't tend to pack well with their big chunky form factor, and even in the bags that they do fit, I tend to have to carry smaller lenses as a result. Now, I personally like carrying smaller sling bags, so this is partly me, but if I were to find one that I were to daily, it'd be the D700 all day long. If I were going to be carrying a big backpack, sure, D3S, but that's not always the case. I don't always have the luxury of carrying the biggest, baddest camera around. This is especially true now that I have a tiny little human that I need to carry around with me for a lot of cases. So the D700, when it comes to ease and convenience, really wins in my books. Being able to just casually pick this up, put it in a bag, and just leave is quite nice. And I can do it basically carrying whatever lens I would normally take on a photo walk. I don't have to consider whether or not I'll need to switch partway through, just because I didn't start off putting the lens I wanted on, because I needed to consider how I was going to pack it in my bag. Plus, since the D700 layout is, as I said, already basically perfect, the convenience of the smaller body combined with the ergonomics of the D200 make this, as a whole, an excellent package. For those who really want the grip, you can just buy the optional grip for the D700 and bolt it on the bottom and remove it when you don't need it. So you get a little more flexibility in that regard as well. I can say that now that I have a D700, I would definitely choose it 99% of the time when compared to the D3S, with that 1% of times really being just because I want to hear the D3S shutter. It is quite a nice one. All right, let's talk cash money. The D700 is gaining in popularity, especially lately. As a result, the issue with the D700 tends to be that it is not a super cheap camera. It's not super expensive. They tend to go for between $275 to $350 American bucks, of course, on your favorite auction sites and other popular used camera retail establishments. Now, for whatever reason, the D3 and D3S cameras seem to be about on par for the pricing of their cameras. Again, about that price point as well. So I'd say for those interested in a 12 megapixel Nikon, I would say that choice is mainly up to your preference for form factor. If you care about the small body, go for the D700, and if you don't, pick up a D3 or D3S. With the D3, not the D3S being the one I'd recommend if you really want that similar image quality to the D700. But how does the D700 stack up if you're just looking for a camera and not specifically to enjoy Nikon's 12 megapixels? Well, if you're already in the Nikon camp, I would have a serious look at the D600 or D610. They tend to be a very similar price, if not a bit cheaper. And I know there are rumblings that the D600 or D610 images look sterile. They look plastic CMOS-y. There's no character in the images. And to that, I'd say, look at it another way. It doesn't have any character that hasn't yet been inputted yet by its user. It's up to you to edit some in there. The technical performance of the D600 and D610 is notable for generally how good it is even today. Plus, as a bonus, these cameras are generally, well, not general, they are considerably lighter than the D700. If you are not tied to Nikon F-mount, take a serious look at the Canon 5D Classic, 5D2, 5D3, or 6D. Each of these has their own pros and cons. And for the persons here that are very budget oriented, the 5DC is still one of the cheapest full frame cameras that you can buy to date. Otherwise, I would personally have a look at a 5D3 or 6D if your price point is about similar to what you want to spend on a D700, with the 5D3 and 6D being more modern shooting experiences. That's all I got, and I get it. The D700, it's one hell of a camera, a crazy entry from Nikon that set the standard for the company and laid the groundwork for a whole series of cameras and expectations for full-frame camera bodies. Let me know if you've ever had a D700. Do you think there's magic in its files? Otherwise, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.